Train to Pakistan, Part 7. Meet Singh inspired no such affection and respect. He was only a peasant who had taken to religion as an escape from work. He had a little land of his own which he had leased out, and this, with the offerings at the temple, gave him a comfortable living. He had no wife or children. He was not learned in the scriptures, nor had he any faculty of conversation. Even his appearance was against him. He was short, fat, and hairy. He was the same age as Imam Baksh, but his beard had none of the serenity of the others. It was black with streaks of grey, and he was untidy. He wore his turban only when reading the scriptures. Otherwise, he went out about his long hair tied in a loose knot held by a little wooden comb. Almost half of the hair was scattered on the nape of his neck. He seldom wore a shirt and only garment. His only garment, a pair of shorts, was always greasy with dirt. But Meet Singh was a man of peace. Envy had never poisoned his affection for Imam Baksh. He only felt that he owed it to his own community to say something when Imam Baksh made any suggestions. Their conversation always had an undercurrent of friendly rivalry. The meeting in the Gurudwara had a melancholic atmosphere. People had little to say, and those who did spoke slowly like prophets. Imam Baksh opened the discussion. May Allah be merciful. We are living in bad times. Few people sighed solemnly, yes, bad days. Meet Singh added, yes, Chacha, this is Kali Yuga, the dark age. There was a long silence, and people shuffled uneasily on their haunches. Some yawned, closing their mouths with loud invocations to God, Ya Allah, Vaheguru, Vahaguru. Lambardar, started Imam Baksh again, you should know what is happening. Why has not the Deputy Sahib sent for you? How am I to know, Chacha? When he sends for me, I will go. He is also at the station and no one is allowed to near it. A young villager interjected in a loud, cheery voice. We are not going to die just yet. We will soon know what is going on. It is a train after all. It may be carrying government treasures and or arms, so they guard it. Haven't you heard? May have been looted. Shut up, rebuked his bearded father angrily. Where there where there are elders, what need you have to talk? I only. That is all, said the father sternly. No one spoke for some time. I have heard, said Imam Baksh, slowly combing his beard with his fingers, that there have been many incidents with trains. The word incident aroused an uneasy feeling in the audience. Yes, lots of incidents have been heard of. Meet Singh agreed after a while. We only ask for Allah's mercy, said Imam Baksh, closing the subject he had himself opened. Meet Singh, not meaning to be outdone in the invocation to the god, added Vaheguru, Vaheguru. They said on in silence, punctuated by yawns and murmurs of Ya Allah, Hey and Hey Vaheguru. Several people on the outer fringe of the assembly stretched themselves on the floor and went to sleep. Suddenly a policeman appeared in the doorway of the Gurudwara. The Lambardar and 3 or 4 villagers stood up. People who were asleep were prodded into getting up. Those who had been dozing sat up in a daze, exclaiming, What is it? What's up? Then hurriedly wrapped their turbans around their head. Who is the Lambardar of this village? Banta Singh walked up to the door. The police took him aside and whispered something. Then as Banta Singh turned back, he said loudly, Quickly, within half an hour, there are 2 military trucks waiting on the station side. I will be there. The policeman walked away briskly. The villagers crowded around Banta Singh. The possession of a secret had lent him an air of importance. His voice had a tone of authority. Everyone get all the wood there is in his house and all the kerosene oil he can spare and bring these to the motor trucks on the station side. You will be paid. The villagers waited for him to tell them why. He ordered them off brusquely. Are you deaf? Haven't you heard? And do you think the police to whip your buttocks before you move? Come along quickly. People dispersed into the village lanes, whispering to each other. The Lambardar went to his own house. A few minutes later, villagers with bundle of woods and bottles of oil started assembling outside the village on the station side. Two large mud green army trucks were parked alongside each other. A row of empty petrol cans stood against a mud wall. A Sikh soldier with a stun gun stood on guard. Another Sikh, an officer with his beard neatly rolled in an air net, sat on the back of one of the trucks with his feet dangling. He watched the wood being stacked in the other truck and nodded his head in reply to the villagers' greetings. The Lambardar stood beside him, taking down the names of the villagers and the quantities they brought. After dumping their bundles of woods on the truck and emptying the bottles of kerosene into the petrol cans, the villagers collected in a little group at a respectful distance from the officer. Imam Baksh put down on the truck the wood he had carried on his head and handed his bottle of oil to the Lambardar. He retied his turban and then greeted the officer loudly. Salam, Sardar Sahib. The officer looked away. Imam Baksh started again. Everything is all right, isn't it, Sardar Sahib? The officer turned around abruptly and snapped, Get along. Don't you see I am busy? Imam Baksh, still adjusting his turban, meekly joined the villagers. When both the trucks were loaded, the officer told Banta Singh to come up to the camp next morning for the money. The trucks rumbled off towards the station. Banta Singh was surrounded by eager villagers. He felt that he was somehow responsible for the insult to Imam Baksh. The villagers were impatient with him. O Lambardar, why don't you tell us something? What is all this big secret you are carrying about? You seem to think you have become someone very important and don't need to talk to us anymore, said Meet Singh angrily. No, bhai, no. If I knew, why would I not tell you? You talk like children. How can I argue with soldiers and policemen? They told me nothing. And didn't you see how that pig's penis spoke to Chacha? One's self-respect is in one's own hands. Why should I have myself insulted by having my turban taken off? Imam Baksh acknowledged the gesture gracefully. Lambardar is right. If somebody barks when you speak to him, it is best to keep quiet. Let us all go to our homes. You can see what they are doing from the tops of your roofs. The villagers dispersed to their rooftops. From there, the trucks could be seen at the camp near the station. They started off again and went east along the railway track till they were beyond the signal. Then they turned up sharp left and bumped across the rails. They turned left again and came back along the line towards the station and disappeared behind the train. All afternoon, the villagers stood on their roofs shouting to each other, asking whether anyone had seen anything. In their excitement, they had forgotten to prepare the midday meal. Mothers fed their children on stale leftovers from the day before. They did not have time to light their hearths. The men did not give fodder to their cattle, nor remember to milk them as evening drew near. When the sun was already under the arches of the bridge, everyone became conscious of having overlooked the daily chorus. It would be dark soon, and the children would clamor for food, but still the women watched, their eyes glued to the station. The cows and buffaloes lowed in the barns, but still the men stayed on the roofs looking towards the station. Everyone expected something to happen. The sun sank behind the bridge, lightening the white clouds which had appeared in the sky with hues of russet, copper, and orange. Then shades of grey blended with the glow as evening gave way to twilight and twilight sank into darkness. The station became a black wall. Wearily, the men and women went down to their courtyards, beckoning the others to do the same. They did not want to be alone in missing anything. The northern horizon, which had turned a bluish grey, showed orange again. The orange turned into copper and then into a luminous russet. Red tongues of flame leaped into the black sky. A soft breeze began to blow towards the village. It brought the smell of burning kerosene, then of wood, and then a faint acrid smell of searing flesh. The village was still in a deathly silence. No one asked anyone else what the order was. They all knew, they had known it all the time. The answer was implicit in the fact that the train had come from Pakistan. That evening, for the first time in the memory of Manu Majra, Imam Bakhsh's sonorous cry did not rise to the heavens to proclaim the glory of God. The day's happenings cast their glooms on the rest house. Hukum Chand had been out since the morning. When his orderly came from the station at midday for a thermos flask of tea and sandwiches, he told the bearer and the sweeper about the train. In the evening, the servants and their families saw the flames shooting up above the line of trees. The fire cast a melancholy urban light on the khaki walls of the bungalow. The day's work had taken a lot out of Hukum Chand. His fatigue was not physical. The sight of so many dead had at first produced a cold numbness. Within a couple of hours, all his emotions were dead, and he watched corpses of men and women and children being dragged out with a little interest as if they had been trunks or bedding. But by evening he began to feel forlorn and sorry for himself. He looked weary and haggard when he stepped out of the car. The bearer, the sweeper, and their families were on the roof looking at the flames. He had to wait for them to come down and open the doors. His bath had not been drawn. Hukumchand felt neglected and more depressed. He lay on his bed, ignoring the servants' attentions. One unlaced and took off his shoes and began to rub his feet. The other brought in buckets of water and filled the bathtub. The magistrate got up abruptly, almost kicking the servant, and went into the bathroom. After a bath and a change of clothes, Hukumchand felt somewhat refreshed. The panka breeze was cool and soothing. He lay down again with his hands over his eyes. Within the dark the chambers of his closed eyes, scenes of day started coming back in panoramic succession. He tried to squash them by pressing his fingers into his eyes. The images only went blacker and redder and then came back. There was a man holding his intestines, with an expression in his eyes which said, "Look what I have got." There were women and children huddled in a corner, their eyes dilated with horror, their mouths still open as if their shirk had just become voiceless. Some of them did not have a scratch on their bodies. There were bodies crammed against the far end wall of the compartment, looking in terror at the empty windows through which must have come shots, spears, and spikes. There were lavatories jammed with corpses of young men who had muscled their way to comparative safety, and all the nauseating smell of putrefying flesh, faces, and urine. The very thought brought vomit to Hukumchand's mouth. The most vivid picture was that of an old peasant with a long white beard. He did not look dead at all. He sat jammed between the rolls of bedding on the upper rack meant for luggage, looking pensively at the scene below him. A tin crimson line of coagulated blood ran from his ear onto his beard. Hukumchand had shaken him by the shoulder, saying, "Baba, Baba," believing he was alive. He was alive. His cold hand stretched itself grotesquely and gripped the magistrate's right foot. The cold sweat came out all over Hukumchand's body. He tried to shout but could only open his mouth. The hand moved up slowly from the ankle to the calf, from the calf to the knee, gripping its way all along. Hukumchand tried to shout again. His voice stuck in his throat. The hand kept moving upwards. As it touched the fleshy part of his thigh, his grip loosened. Hukumchand began to moan, and then, with a final effort, broke out of the nightmare with an agonized shriek. He sat up with a look of terror in his eyes. The bearer was standing beside him, looking equally frightened. "I thought the Sahib was tired and would like his fat feet pressed." Hukumchand could not speak. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and sank back on the pillow, exclaiming, Hai Ram, Hai Ram. The nervous outburst purged him of fear. He felt weak and foolish. After some time, a sense of calm descended on him. Get me some whiskey. The bearer brought him a tray with whiskey, soda, and a tumbler. Hukumchand filled a quarter of glass with the honey colored liquid. The bearer filled the rest with soda. The magistrate drank half of the glass in a gulp and lay back. The alcohol poured into his system, warming his jaded nerves to life. The servant started pressing his feet again. He looked up at the ceiling, feeling relaxed and just pleasantly tired. The sweeper started lighting lamps in the rooms. He put one on the table beside Hukumchand's bed. A moth fluttered around the chimney and flew up in a spiral to the ceilings. The geckos darted across from the wall. The moth hit the ceiling well out of the gecko's reach and spiraled back to the lamp. The lizards watched with their shining black eyes. The moth flew up again and down again. Yukumchand knew that if it alighted on the ceiling for a second, one of the geckos would get it fluttering between its little crocodile jaws. Perhaps that was its destiny. It was everyone's destiny. Whether it was in hospital, trains, or in the jaws of reptiles, it was all the same. One could even die in bed alone, and no one would discover until the stench spread all around, and maggots moved in and out of the sockets of the eyes, and geckos ran over the face with their slimy, clammy bellies. Hukumchand wiped his face with his hand. How could one escape one's own mind? He gulped the rest of the whiskey and poured himself another. Death has always been an obsession with Hukumchand. As a child, he had seen his aunt die after the birth of a dead child. Her whole system had been poisoned. For days, she had had hallucinations and had waved her arms about frantically to ward off the spirit of death which stood at the foot of her bed. She had died shrieking with terror, staring and pointing at the wall. The scene had never left Hukumchand's mind. Later in his youth, he had fought the fear of death by spending many hours at the cremation ground near the university. He had watched young and old brought on crude bamboo stretchers, lamented for and then burned. Visits to the cremation ground left him with a sense of tranquility. He had got over the immediate terror of death, but the idea of ultimate dissolution was always present in his mind. It made him kind, charitable, and tolerant. It even made him cheerful in adversity. He had taken the loss of his children with phlegmatic resignation. He had borne with an illiterate, unattractive wife without complaint. It all came from his belief that the only absolute truth was death. The rest, love, ambition, pride, values of all kinds, was to be taken with a pinch of salt. He did so with a clear conscience, although he accepted gifts and obliged friends when they get into the trouble. He was not corrupt. He occasionally joined in parties arranged for singing and dancing and sometimes sex. But he was not immoral. What did it really matter in the end? That was the core of Hukumchand's philosophy of life, and he lived well. But a train load of dead was too much for even Hukumchand's fatalism. He could not square a massacre with a philosophical belief in the inevitability of death. It bewildered and frightened him by its violence and its magnitude. The picture of his aunt biting her tongue and bleeding at the mouth, her eyes staring at space, come back to him in all its vivid horror. Whiskey did not help to take it away. The room was lit by the headlights of the car and then left darker than before. The car had probably been put into a garage. Hukumchand grew conscious of the coming nights. Servants would soon be retiring to their quarters to sleep snugly surrounded by their women and children. He would be left alone in the bungalow with its empty rooms peopled by phantoms of his own creation. No. He must get the orderlies to sleep somewhere nearby, on the veranda perhaps. Or would they suspect he was scared? He would not let them that he might be wanting during the night and must have them at hand, and that would pass unnoticed. Baraha, Baira Sahib. The bearer came in through with the wire gauge door. Where have you put my charpai for the night? Sahib's bed has not been laid yet. It is clouded. There might be rain. Would Huzur like to sleep on the veranda? No, I will stay in my room. The boy can pull the panka for an hour or two till it gets cool. Tell the orderlies to sleep on the veranda. I may want them for urgent work tonight, he added without looking up at the men. Yes, Sahib, I will tell them straightway before they go to the bed. Should I bring the Sahib's dinner? Hukumchand had forgotten about dinner. No, I do not want any dinner. Just tell the orderlies to put their beds on the veranda. Tell the driver to be there too. If there is not enough space on the veranda, tell him to sleep in the next room. The bearer went out. Hukumchand felt relieved. He had saved face. He could sleep peacefully with all these people about him. He listened to the reassuring sounds of human activity, the servants arguing about places on the veranda, beds being laid just outside his door, a lamp being brought in the next room, and furniture being moved to make place for charpais. The headlights of the car coming in lit the room once more. The car stopped outside the veranda. Hukumchand heard voices of men and women and the jingles of bells. He sat up and looked through the wire gauge door. It was the party of the musicians, the old woman and the girl prostitute. He had forgotten about them. Baraha, Huzur. Tell the driver to take the musicians and old woman back and let the servants sleep in their quarters. If I need them, I will send for them. Hukumchand felt a little stupid being caught like that. The servants would certainly laugh about it, but he did not care. He poured himself another whiskey. The servant started moving out before the bearer came to speak to them. The lamp in the next room was removed. The driver started the car again. He switched on the headlights and switched them off again. The old woman would not get in the car but began to argue with the bearer. Her voice rose higher and higher till it passed the bounds of argument and addressed itself to the magistrate inside the room. May your government go on forever? May your pen inscribe figures of thousands, nay hundreds of thousands. Hukumchand lost his temper. Go, he shouted. You have to pay my debt of the other day. Go, bearer, send her away. The woman's voice came down. She was quickly hustled into the car. The car went out, leaving only the flickering yellow light of the oil lamp beside Hukumchand's bed. He rose, picked up the lamp and the table, and put them in the corner by the door. The moth circled around the glass chimney, hitting the wall on either side. The geckos crawled down from the ceiling to the wall near the lamp. As the moth alighted on the wall, one of the geckos crept up stealthily behind it, pounced and caught it fluttering in its jaws. Hukumchand watched the whole thing with bland indifference. The door opened and shut gently. A small dark figure slid into the room. The silver sequins on the girl's sari twinkled in the lamplight and sent 100 spots of light playing on the wall and the ceiling. Hukumchand turned around. The girl stood staring at him with her large black eyes. The diamond in her nose glistened brightly. She looked thoroughly frightened. Come, said the magistrate, making room for her beside him and holding out his hand. The girl came and sat down on the edge of the bed, looking away. Hukumchand put his arm around her waist. He stroked her thighs and belly and played with her little unformed breasts. She sat impassive and rigid. Hukumchand shuffled further away and mumbled drowsily, Come and lie down. The girl stretched herself beside the magistrate. The sequins on her sari tickled his face. She wore perfume made of khas. It had the fresh odor of dry earth when earth has been sprinkled on it. Her breath smelled of cardamom, her bosom of honey. Hukumchand snuggled against her like a child and fell fast asleep. Monsoon is not another word for rain. As its original Arabic name indicates, it is a season. There is a summer monsoon as well as a winter monsoon, but it is only the nimbued southwest winds of summer that makes a mosam, the season of the rains. Winter monsoon is simply rain in winter. It is like a cold shower on a frosty morning. It leaves one chilled and shivering. Although it is good for the crops, people pray for it to end. Fortunately, it does not last very long. The summer monsoon is quite another affair. It is preceded by several months of working up a thirst so that the waters come they are drunk deep and with relish. From the end of the February the sun starts getting hotter and spring gives way to summer. Flowers wither, then flowering trees take their place. First come the orange showers of the flame of the forest, the vermilion of the coral tree, and the virginal white of the champak. They are followed by the mauve jacaranda. They are followed by the jacaranda, the flamboyant gulmohar, and the soft gold cascades of the laburnum. Then the trees also lose their flowers. Their leaves fall, their bare branches stretch up to the sky begging for water, but there is no water. The sun comes up earlier than before and licks up the drops of dew before the fevered earth can moist its lips. It blazes all away it blazes away all day long in the cloudless grey sky, drying up wells and streams and lakes. It sears the glass and thorny scrub till they catch fire. The fires spread and the dry jungles burn like matchwood. The sun goes on day after day from east to west, scorching relentlessly. The earth cracks up, and deep fissures open their gaping mouths asking for water, but there is no water, the only shimmering haze at noon making mirage lakes of quicksilver. Poor villagers take their thirsty cattle out to drink and are struck dead. The rich wear glasses, sunglasses, and hide behind chicks of khus fiber on which their servants pour water. The sun makes an alley of the breeze. It heats the air till it becomes tallow and then sends it back on its errand. Even in the intense heat, the loose, warm caresses are sensuous and pleasant. It brings up the prickly heat. It produces a numbness which makes the head nod and the eyes heavy with sleep. It brings on a stroke which take its victim as gently as breeze bears a fluff of thistledown. Then comes a period of false hopes. The dew drops. The air becomes still. From the southern origin, a black wall begins to advance. Hundreds of kites and crows fly ahead. Can it be? No, it is a dust storm. A fine powder begins to fall. A solid mass of locusts covers the sun. They devour whatever is left on the trees and in the fields. Then comes the storm itself. In furious sweeps, it smacks open doors and windows, banging them forward and backward, smashing their glass panes. Thatched roofs and corrugated iron sheets are borne aloft into the sky like bits of paper. Trees are torn up by the roots and fall across power lines. The tangled wires electrocute people and start fires in houses. The storm carries the flames to other houses till there is a conflagration. All this happens in a few seconds. Before you can say Chakravarti Rajgopalachari, the gale is gone. The dust hanging in the air settles on your books, furniture, and food. It gets in your eyes and ears and throat and nose. This happens over and over again until the people have lost all hope. They are disillusioned, dejected, thirsty, and sweating. The prickly heat on the back of their necks is like emery paper. There is another lull. A hot, petrified silence prevails. Then comes the shrill, strange call of a bird. Why has it left its cool, bosky shade and come out in the sun? People look up wearily at the lifeless sky. Yes, there it is with its mate. They are like large black and white bulbuls with perky crests and long tails. They are pie crested cuckoos who have flown all the way from Africa ahead of the monsoon. Isn't there a gentle breeze blowing? And hasn't it a damp smell? Wasn't the rumble which drowned the birds' anguished cry the sound of thunder? The people hurry to the roofs to see. The same ebony wall is coming up from the east. A flock of herons fly sky. There is a flash of lightning which outlines the daylight. The wind fills the black sails of the cloud and they billow out across the sun. A profound shadow falls on the earth. There is another clap of thunder. Big drops of rain fall and dry up in a dust. The fragrant smell rises from the earth. Another flash of lightning and another crack of thunder, like the roar of a hungry tiger. It has come. Sheets of water and wave after wave. The people lift their faces to the clouds and let the abundance of water cover them. Schools, offices close. All work stops. Men, women, children run madly about the streets, waving their arms and shouting, Ho ho, Hosanna, to the miracle of the monsoon. The monsoon is not like the ordinary rain which comes and goes. Once it is on, it stays for 2 months and or more. Its advent is greeted with joy. Parties set out for picnics and litter the countryside with the skins and stones of mangoes. Women and children make swings on the branches of trees and spend the day in sport and song. Peacocks spread their tails and strut about with their mates. The woods echo with their shrill cries. But after a few days, the flush of enthusiasm is gone. The earth becomes a big stretch of swamp and mud. Wells and lakes fill up and burst their bounds. In towns gutters get clogged and streets become turbid streams. In villages, mud walls of huts melt in the water and thatched roofs sag and descend on the inmates. Rivers which keep rising steadily from the time the summer's heat start melting the snows suddenly turns into floods as the monsoon spends itself on the mountains. Roads, railway tracks and bridges go under water. Houses near the river bank are swept down to the sea.